The fog had not yet lifted when Corporal Edwin Haskell heard the first rumble. It was low and mechanical, the unmistakable grinding of tracked vehicles pushing through wet earth. He pressed himself deeper into the hedgerow, chest flat against damp Norman soil, and watched three dark shapes emerge from the tree line 400 meters ahead, Panzer IVs. Their angular silhouettes cut through the morning mist like iron ghosts, turrets traversing slowly, scanning for movement. Behind them came infantry, 40 German soldiers in loose formation, Feldgrau uniforms blending with the gray dawn. Edwin's squad of 12 Americans had been sent to observe a crossroads. They had found something far worse. With less than 2 minutes before those tanks reached their position, Edwin understood that the 38-pound radio on his back might be the only thing standing between his squad and an unmarked grave in the bocage. To understand how Edwin came to kneel in that hedgerow, we must first understand the man he was before the war changed him. He was born in 1921 on a wheat farm outside Grand Island, Nebraska, the second of 4 children in a family that measured worth in acres planted, and Sundays faithfully attended. His father was a church deacon who believed in hard work and harder scripture. His mother taught Sunday school to the children of neighboring homesteads. By 18, Edwin had begun studies at a Lutheran seminary in Omaha, convinced his calling lay in scripture rather than soil. He was quiet, introspective, more at ease with books than with the rough housing that occupied his brothers. When war came, he registered for the draft, expecting his poor eyesight would keep him stateside, perhaps filing papers at some rear echelon depot. It did not. The Army needed men, and Edwin's vision, though weak, was sufficient for support duties. He trained as a radio operator and shipped to England with an infantry platoon bound for France. His squad mates never quite knew what to make of him. Edwin rarely cursed, never drank, and spent evenings reading a pocket Bible worn soft from years of handling. He was not weak. He carried the -300 Seychelles rupees for miles without complaint, but he lacked the hard edge that combat demanded. Some called him preacher with affection. Others used the nickname to suggest he did not belong. Edwin accepted both without protest. He had not asked to be here. He had only asked to be useful. By late July 1944, usefulness meant survival. The Normandy landings had succeeded, but the promised breakout had stalled in the blood-soaked fields beyond the beaches. The bocage, ancient hedgerows, sunken lanes, undergrowth so thick that visibility collapsed to yards, turned every Norman field into a natural fortress. Tanks bogged down in lanes that became death traps. Infantry paid for each hedgerow in blood, advancing by feet rather than miles. German defenders used the terrain with brutal efficiency, transforming every earthen wall into a prepared firing position, every sunken road into an ambush corridor. Commanders called it the worst ground they had ever fought on. The men who bled through it used harsher words. Edwin's platoon was massing for Operation Cobra, the offensive designed to finally break the stalemate. But Cobra had not begun. Current orders were simpler. Probe forward, gather intelligence, avoid heavy contact. On the morning of July 24th, Edwin's squad drew a reconnaissance mission toward a crossroads 2 miles ahead. Reports suggested light German presence, a supply route perhaps, or a signals post. The task was routine. Observe, report, return before noon. Nothing more. They departed before dawn. 12 men moving single file through gaps in the hedgerows. Sergeant Carver, a lean and weathered veteran of the North Africa campaign, led with careful silence. He kept the pace deliberately slow, intervals tight enough that every man remained visible to the one behind. Edwin walked mid-column. The SCR-300's weight settled into his aching shoulders. The folding antenna collapsed to clear the endless branches. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet grass, turned earth, and distant burning. No one spoke. The only sounds were boots pressing into soft ground and the muted rustle of gear. They reached their position as pale light touched the horizon, a shallow fold in the ground. Behind a thick hedgerow, with a clear view of the crossroads 200 meters ahead, Carver signaled them to settle in. Edwin shrugged off the radio and ran a frequency check, listening for static that confirmed the set was live. The crossroads lay empty and silent. No movement, no vehicles. The mission seemed as routine as promised. Then the fog lifted. Edwin saw them first not for sharp eyes, but because he was looking east when the silhouettes emerged. 3 Panzer IVs. Long-barreled 75mm guns leveled forward. Tracks grinding through wet earth with a sound like tearing fabric. Behind them came infantry, spreading across the open fields with the unhurried confidence of men expecting no resistance. This was no patrol. This was counterattack and armored thrust meant to disrupt American preparations. Before Cobra could launch, and through blind misfortune, Edwin's squad had walked directly into its path. Carver's face drained of color. The hedgerows that had hidden their approach now trapped them. East meant open ground suicide under tank-mounted machine guns. West offered more hedgerows, but the Panzers would reach the crossroads before anyone could clear them. No American armor was close. No air cover had been assigned. The only hope was the radio on Edwin's back and the artillery battery 6 miles behind them. Lines guns that might answer in time, if the coordinates were right, if the crews were ready, if the shells flew true across Normandy's sky before German steel arrived. Edwin stared at the advancing Panzers. He looked at the 11 faces around him, each caught in the frozen arithmetic of no good choices. Then, without waiting for orders that might never come, he reached for the handset. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. The 12 Americans lay frozen in the shallow depression behind the hedgerow, watching the Panzers grind forward through the dissipating fog. The sounds reached them clearly now, the metallic clatter of tracks, the low rumble of Maybach engines, the distant shouts of German infantry coordinating their advance. Sergeant Carver's jaw worked silently as his mind raced through options that offered nothing but varying degrees of disaster. Retreat meant crossing open ground the tanks would rake with machine gun fire before any man cleared 50 meters. Scattering into the fields invited the same fate spread across a wider, killing ground. Staying men hoping 3 Panzer commanders and 40 infantrymen somehow failed to notice a dozen Americans crouched behind a hedgerow, directly in their path. Hope was not a tactic. Carver knew it. Every man in that depression knew it. Edwin did not wait for orders. His hands moved with a mechanical certainty of repetition drilled across months of training and weeks of combat. He pulled the handset from its cradle, pressed the transmit key, and spoke in a voice far steadier than the terror coiling through his chest. The -300 Seychelles rupees was temperamental equipment, 38 pounds of vacuum tubes, batteries, and wiring that worked flawlessly until humidity, shock, or simple bad luck silenced it without warning. Range was limited to 3 miles under ideal conditions, often less in the hedgerow country, where every earthen wall scattered signals like stones thrown into water. But the artillery battery was 6 miles back, and between Edwin and those guns sat a relay station manned by a corporal whose attention might be elsewhere, whose equipment might be failing, whose response might come seconds delayed. The first transmission brought only static. Edwin adjusted the frequency dial a fraction of a degree, pressed transmit again, and repeated his call sign. This time a voice crackled through, distant, distorted, but unmistakably human. Edwin forced himself to breathe. He recited the grid coordinates he had memorized during their approach, describing the target with the clinical precision the Army demanded. 3 armored vehicles, enemy infantry in support, bearing east toward friendly positions. Immediate fire mission requested. The voice on the other end repeated the coordinates back. Edwin confirmed. Then silence stretched across the channel like a held breath. The Panzers were 300 meters out now. Edwin could see the hull markings on the lead tank. The long barrel of its 75mm gun elevated slightly as it traversed rough ground. The commander stood half exposed in the turret hatch, field glasses raised, scanning the terrain ahead. Behind the tanks, German infantry advanced in loose formation, rifles held ready, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who expected no resistance. One soldier paused, turned toward the hedgerow, and seemed to stare directly at the depression, where 12 Americans pressed themselves into the earth. Edwin's heart stopped. The soldier looked away, resumed walking, and Edwin remembered to breathe. Carver crawled close, his face tight with controlled fear. He asked what the radio had said. Edwin told him the mission was pending, confirmation had not come. Response time was unknown. The guns might be engaged elsewhere. Carver cursed softly and looked back toward the Panzers. 250 meters now. At their current speed, they would reach the hedgerow in less than 2 minutes. If the artillery did not answer, there would be no second chance. The radio crackled. Edwin pressed the handset to his ear and heard the words he had been praying for. Fire mission confirmed. Battery firing. Estimated time to impact 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Edwin looked at the Panzers, calculated their advance, and felt his stomach tighten. At current speed, they would cover another 100 meters before the shells arrived. That would place them directly adjacent to the hedgerow to close for artillery. Inside the blast radius, that would kill Americans as surely as Germans. The coordinates Edwin had transmitted were already obsolete. The shells would land behind the tanks, not on them. He made the decision without consultation. There was no time for debate, no margin for democracy. Edwin keyed the handset and transmitted an adjustment. Shift fire 100 meters forward. Tighten the pattern. Immediate correction. The voice on the other end hesitated. Forward adjustment meant shells falling dangerously close to the coordinates Edwin had given as his own position. The radioman was asking for artillery to land within 100 meters of friendly troops. The voice requested confirmation. Edwin confirmed. The channel went silent, somewhere behind him. Private Riley whispered a prayer, words Edwin recognized from childhood. Fragments of psalm and petition murmured into Norman soil. Other men pressed their faces into the earth, fingers clawing at grass, bodies rigid with the anticipation of violence they could not control. Carver stared at Edwin with an expression caught between fury and desperate hope. He understood what Edwin had done. He understood the risk. He said nothing. The lead Panzer's turret began to rotate. The long gun barrel swung slowly, inexorably, until it pointed directly at the hedgerow. The tank commander lowered his field glasses and shouted something to his crew. Edwin saw the barrel depress slightly, acquiring a target the Germans had finally spotted. He thought of Nebraska, of wheat fields golden under summer sun, of his mother's voice reading scripture in the quiet evenings of his childhood. He thought of the 11 men beside him, their faces pressed into foreign soil, their lives suspended on the trajectory of shells that might already be falling short. Then he heard a distant whistle, faint at first, then rising, sharpening, becoming a sound that filled the sky and drowned all other noise. Edwin flattened himself against the earth, handset still clutched in white-knuckled fingers, and watched the Lee Panzer's turret complete its rotation. The gun barrel stared at him like an unblinking eye. The whistle became a scream. The world held its breath. The shells arrived. The world returned in fragments. First came sound, a high-pitched ringing that drowned all other noise, then slowly receded to reveal the crackle of burning fuel and the distant screams of wounded men. Then came sensation, the weight of dirt pressing against Edwin's back, the sharp sting of small cuts across his hands and face, the metallic taste of blood where he had bitten his tongue. He lifted his head from the earth and saw smoke rising in thick black columns against the pale morning sky, where 3 Panzers had been advancing seconds before. There was now fire and twisted metal and the scattered remains of a German armored thrust that would advance no further. The 105mm shells had landed with precision that bordered on miraculous. The round struck the lead Panzer directly, punching through the thinner top armor and detonating the ammunition stored within. The tank had ceased to exist as a coherent machine, its turret blown 30 feet from the hull, its crew killed instantly. The second Panzer took a near miss that shattered its left track assembly and ignited the external fuel can strapped to its rear deck. Flames engulfed the engine compartment within seconds, forcing the surviving crew to abandon the vehicle and flee into the hedgerows. The 3rd Panzer, attempting to reverse away from the barrage, threw its right track on the soft ground and slewed sideways into a drainage ditch. Its crew scrambled out and ran, leaving the immobilized machine to burn as secondary explosions cooked off its remaining ammunition. German infantry scattered like startled birds. The coordinated advance dissolved into chaos as men dove for cover, sought shelter behind hedgerows, or simply ran toward the tree line from which they had emerged minutes before. No one organized a counterattack. No one rallied the survivors. The panzer commanders who might have imposed order were dead or fleeing, and the infantry leaderless and exposed thought only of survival. Within 2 minutes, the crossroads fell silent except for the crackling of flames and the moans of wounded Germans. Too injured to retreat, Edwin rose slowly to his knees, then to his feet. His ears still rang, but the ringing was fading now, replaced by the ragged sound of his own breathing and the first tentative voices of his squad mates. Sergeant Carver emerged from the depression where he had pressed himself flat, dirt caked across his face, eyes wide with the particular disbelief of a man who had prepared himself to die and found himself instead alive. He looked at Edwin but said nothing. There were no words adequate to the moment. He simply nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any commendation that would follow. The other men rose one by one, checking themselves for wounds, staring at the burning tanks with expressions caught between relief and horror. Private Riley still whispered fragments of prayer, his voice barely audible above the distant flames. Corporal Martinez helped Private Jensen to his feet, then noticed the blood spreading across Jensen's shoulder. A shell fragment had torn through the fabric of his jacket and lodged in the muscle beneath. Jensen looked at the wound with detached curiosity, shock numbing the pain that would come later. 2 men helped him toward cover while another retrieved the medical kit. It was the only American blood spilled that morning. Every man in the squad had survived. They remained at the hedgerow until relief arrived 2 hours later. A platoon of infantry supported by a Sherman tank that had pushed forward when reports of the German counterattack reached battalion headquarters. The lieutenant commanding the relief force surveyed the burning panzers with undisguised amazement. He asked what had happened. Carver pointed at Edwin, who sat quietly beside his radio, cleaning dirt from the frequency dial with methodical care. The lieutenant looked at the young corporal with the thick glasses and the worn Bible visible in his breast pocket, and whatever he had expected to find, this was clearly not it. Intelligence reports compiled in the following days confirmed what the men on the ground had suspected. The 3 panzers were the forward element of a larger armored reserve, positioned to disrupt American preparations for Operation Cobra. Their destruction created a gap in German defensive coordination that American commanders exploited within hours. The crossroads Edwin's squad had been sent to observe became a key passage point for the southern thrust of Cobra's breakout. Tanks and infantry poured through the gap, beginning the mobile warfare that would eventually liberate France. None of the after-action reports mentioned Edwin by name. The crossroads was simply another coordinate on maps that tracked the larger movements of armies. Edwin received a Bronze Star 6 weeks later. The citation described his actions in the passive language beloved by military bureaucracy. Fire mission successfully coordinated under enemy contact, contributing to the destruction of 3 enemy armored vehicles and the disruption of hostile operations. It said nothing of the 90 seconds, during which 12 lives hung suspended between shell trajectories and tank barrels. It said nothing of the decision to adjust coordinates forward, accepting the risk of death to ensure the enemy died first. It said nothing of the quiet faith that had steadied his hands when terror should have frozen them. Citations never captured such things. They were not designed to. Edwin returned to Nebraska in the autumn of 1945. He completed his seminary studies the following spring and accepted a position at a small Lutheran church outside Grand Island, not far from the wheat farm where he had been born. He served the congregation for 43 years, baptizing children, marrying young couples, burying the old. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked about his service, He offered only that he had been fortunate to be useful once. When it mattered, he kept the Bronze Star in a drawer beside his ordination certificate to documents from the different lives that somehow belonged to the same quiet man. He died in 1994, mourned by a congregation that remembered his gentle sermons and his patient counsel. Few who attended his funeral knew what he had done in a Norman hedgerow 50 years before. Few understood that the soft-spoken minister who had guided their spiritual lives had once held 12 souls in his hands and chosen, in 90 desperate seconds, to risk everything on a voice crackling through static and shells falling from an empty sky. History rarely remembers such men. Their names fade in the footnotes, their courage absorbed into the larger narrative of victory. But they were there, in the moments when everything balanced on a razor's edge, and their presence made all the difference.